In this part of the course, we're going to be examining LAN technologies, specifically Ethernet. That's our most popular LAN technology in modern networks. We're going to begin with an overview of Ethernet, take a look at some of Ethernet's operations. Then we're going to get our hands dirty and we're going to do some configuration on Cisco Catalyst Ethernet switches. And finally, we'll take a look at troubleshooting Ethernet networks. In this module, we're going to take a look at the most popular of all of our LAN technologies out there today, and that is Ethernet. We'll begin by taking a look at the history of Ethernet. We'll see some of the speed and distance limitations of the various flavors of Ethernet that are out there today, and also we'll consider basic Ethernet switch operation. What is a collision domain? What is a broadcast domain? What is a CAM table? Let's get started. Let's begin our discussion of Ethernet by considering the history of Ethernet. Ethernet was developed by Xerox back in 1972. Xerox was trying to come up with a way for computers to talk to laser printers, and the result was Ethernet. Since that time, we've seen many different combinations and permutations of Ethernet. We can run Ethernet over unshielded twisted pair. We can run it over fiber optic cabling. Even in a wireless network, your wireless access point probably connects via Ethernet into the wired network. Your video game in your home might have an Ethernet connector on the back of it. I think we can safely say that Ethernet has become the dominant LAN technology as compared to some of its earlier competitors like Token Ring or ArcNet or LocalTalk. Today, most of our network devices are somehow going to involve Ethernet connectivity. And over the years, there have been a variety of ways that we could connect into an Ethernet network. A couple of the early approaches were called 10BASE-2 and 10BASE-5. The naming came from this. The 10 represents the speed, the capacity of the link in megabits per second. So Ethernet for many years ran at 10 megabits per second, and that was about it. The base in 10BASE-5, 10BASE-2, the base referred to the type of network connection. It was baseband as opposed to broadband. With baseband, the signal is taking up all of the frequencies on that medium. With broadband, we can have different channels carved out of our medium. Much like your cable TV, you can tune into different channels. That would be an example of broadband, but Ethernet used baseband, so it's 10BASE-5. 10BASE-2 as examples. And the 10BASE-5, the 5 referred to the distance limitation, and the 5 meant 500 meters as a distance limitation. And the 10BASE-5 cabling, it was fairly thick coaxial cabling. Some people called it garden hose cabling, and the way you would attach to that, one way to attach to that was you got this little device called it was called a vampire tap, and it literally went in, it penetrated the shielding, the outside of the cable, and it went in and it touched the core of the cable to make a contact, and then you would connect that to a computer. Sometimes there would be a little 15-pin adapter called an AUI adapter that you would use to connect to your end station, and this garden hose-like cable would weave its way through the office space in a building, and devices would tap in, literally, they would tap in to that cable. That was a fairly expensive way to do things. This is fairly thick, expensive cable. A more economical type of cable, a thinner cable, was used by 10BASE-2. 10BASE-2 was called ThinNet because it was a thinner cable. 10BASE-5 was called ThickNet. In fact, 10BASE-2, because it was less expensive, also became known as CheaperNet. And you might guess 10BASE-5, 10 megabits per second, baseband 500 meters. You might guess that 10BASE-2 would be 10 megabits per second, and it is. Baseband, and it is. And you might suspect it stands for 200 meters. Actually, it doesn't. It's close. They picked 2 because it's close to 200 meters, but to be technically accurate, the distance limitation is 185 meters. So 500 meters for 10BASE-5 or ThickNet, 185 meters for 10BASE-2 or ThinNet or CheaperNet. Today, though, we rarely see 10BASE-5 or 10BASE-2 technologies. We're most likely to see unshielded twisted pair, and there are even different categories of unshielded twisted pair, depending on the gauge of the wire, how the individual pairs are twisted together. We could have category 3 cabling as one example. That was used in a lot of telephone, a lot of PBX installations. So when Ethernet using unshielded twisted pair came on the scene, people started using the existing PBX wiring, the category 3 wiring, to hook up computers. And that was great if we were running at 10 megabits per second. It doesn't work for 100 megabits per second, however. For 100 megabits per second, we need to go at least to category 5. And then we've got category 5E and category 6. It goes on. And today, we're probably going to be using something like category 6. We might be using category 6A to support gigabit connections in our network. Gigabit Ethernet. We've come a long way from the 10 megabit per second days. And as we go through the remainder of this module, we're going to see some of the different types of Ethernet that are out there today. Not all of them are going to run over copper. Some are going to use fiber optic. And we've got different kinds of fiber optic cabling if you remember our earlier discussion. We have multi-mode fiber, we have single mode fiber. Typically, single mode fiber, because it avoids the multi-mode delay distortion that we discussed. Typically, single mode fiber is going to give us a longer distance limitation than multi-mode fiber. Let's talk about that next. As a reference, we have a table showing us several of the Ethernet standards out there today, the kind of media over which Ethernet might run on a given standard, what the bandwidth limitation is of that standard, and what the distance limitation is. In the early days of Ethernet, we were probably going to be using either 10 base 5 or 10 base 2. Remember, the 10 refers to the speed, the bandwidth. 10 indicates 10 megabits per second. The base in 10 base 5 represents baseband as opposed to broadband, meaning that all of the frequencies on the media are used by this transmission. It's not like we have channels like you have on a cable TV in your home. That would be an example of broadband, but here baseband, we're using all of the available frequencies for this one transmission. And the 5 in 10 base 5, that indicates 500 meters as the distance limitation. Now, that is not a hard and fast rule that we can always turn to. For example, 10 base 2, the 2 is suggesting perhaps that we have a distance limitation of 200 meters. In actuality, it's close to 200 meters, but it's really 185 meters. Another very popular Ethernet standard for many years was 10 base T. This allowed us to start using unshielded twisted pair, and we could use lower end unshielded twisted pair, category 3 specifically, that was used commonly in telephone systems within businesses. You might have existing PBX, existing private branch exchange wiring for a telephone system that's already running to your offices. Well, installers just started using that existing category 3 wiring to connect to Ethernet devices, and that worked great, but we were limited to 10 megabits per second. The distance limitation was 100 meters. And we won't go through all of these, but notice the speeds keep increasing and increasing on the table. 100 indicating 100 megabits per second, 1000 representing 1 gigabit per second. There's also 10G, that's a shortcut way of writing 10 gigabits per second, and even 100G, 100 gigabits per second. And when you start to get into some of the higher speeds, if you want to travel fairly significant distances, you probably are going to be using some type of fiber optic cabling. Notice that most of the higher speed standards are going to be using multi-mode fiber, labeled as MMF, or single-mode fiber, SMF. And generally, single-mode fiber can go further than multi-mode fiber because we don't have to contend with the issue of multi-mode delay distortion. As an example, 1000 base LX. Check this one out. It can run on either multi-mode or single-mode fiber. But if we're doing multi-mode, we're limited to 550 meters. If we're using single mode, we can go up to 5 kilometers. And this is not to say that every high-speed Ethernet network is necessarily using fiber. With recent developments in unshielded twisted pair technology, we could have category 6A cabling running at a speed of 10 billion, 10 gigabits per second, with a distance limitation of 100 meters.
And now that we understand some of the basic Ethernet standards that are out there, the device and our network to which our Ethernet devices are going to be attaching, it's probably going to be an Ethernet switch. And a switch logically works about the same as an Ethernet bridge. A bridge is an older technology developed back in the 80s. Switches are faster than bridges. They have dedicated circuitry called ASICs, application specific integrated circuits, but they both make forwarding decisions the same way. They make forwarding decisions based on destination MAC addresses, media access control addresses, 48-bit addresses that are burned in to the network interface card, the NIC, in our end stations. And I thought it would be fun as we start to talk about basic switch operation and bridge operation to go on location. So in our next video, as we start to take a look at switch operation, we're going to go down to the Bahamas. We're going to be in Paradise Island, and we're going to be using the Royal Towers Hotel, which has a big bridge interconnecting a couple of towers. We're going to use that as a metaphor to see how traffic would be forwarded across a bridge and which traffic would or would not be forwarded across a bridge. We'll see you in just a moment in the Bahamas.